up, everybody? Welcome back to Debating Metal. I am your host, Kenneth, the Dean of Metal, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Kaye. Today, we're doing something a little different, a little more discussion-based, kind of in line with the name of the show. Today's topic is best band lineups.
As music trends and egos come into play, almost every band goes through some lineup changes. Some bands more than others. Sometimes changes work for the better, such as a new member bringing life into a band on the decline, or an old member returning at the right time, or even an experienced talent helping mature a fledgling band. Today, Kenneth and I have chosen 8 bands to discuss which lineups we view to be their best.
And after we're done with that, we'll give you our big 4 rainbow lineups. So sit back, relax, turn it up to 11, and let the debate begin. So, Chris, this is pretty much what the show is supposed to be about: a discussion, an opinionated discussion about things that we talk about on a general basis and have a regular conversation on. We always talk about stuff like this. And today I think more than any other show that we've done out of 145 previous shows, this one's probably the most exactly for the name that it can be, Debating Metal. Although you and I, like we always tell everyone, we don't look at our notes beforehand. We don't really share information back and forth. So some of your band lineups may be the same as my band lineup choices for your band, and vice versa. And so the discussion may not be as debated as possible, but some of the others I'm pretty positive are going to be a nice debate. So with that said, why don't you go ahead and go first about which lineup you think is best for whichever band you choose first.
All right, so I'm gonna choose to go with Death for my first band. I've spoken about them in the past. They are one of my favorite bands of all time. It's an interesting one because there are no 2 lineups the same throughout their entire career as far as album releases. And part of that is Chuck just liked to work with a lot of different musicians. There was some turmoil in the band, etc. You know, the typical things that bands go through. So for my choice, I went with the Individual Thought Patterns lineup of Chuck Schuldiner on lead vocals and guitars, Andy LaRocque on guitars, Steve DiGiorgio on fretless bass, and Gene Hoglan on drums. The reason I picked this, even though it is a very short lineup, is mostly because this was the lineup that had both Steve DiGiorgio and Gene Hoglan in it. And I like those 2 guys, I kind of think of as the definitive lineup along with Chuck. And there's multiple reasons for that. Steve DiGiorgio was hanging around Chuck at the very beginning of Death's career. He helped jam on those early sessions, helped write some of the bass parts, even though he's not credited. That was early on in their career, and he was in and out of the band for a long period of time. And unfortunately, because of his life going on and his ability to make money, had to take other jobs, had a kid, things like that. Like, he was sometimes not available, even though he wrote songs for different albums, he's not available to record. So this being the album that had him, not only him, but Gene Hoglan, who I think is such an amazing drummer and somebody that really, like, he was also on Symbolic, which a lot of people think is their best album. Those 2 guys being in this lineup, I think kind of in my mind, whenever somebody says Death, I think of those 2 guys along with Chuck. He played with a lot of great musicians, but I think for me, and no slight to Andy LaRocque whatsoever. I mean, he added amazing solos in this album as well. So, like, this to me is that definitive lineup.
Okay, so I disagree. No,
All right.
Look, I am not the biggest death metal. I'm not the biggest Death fan in the world, and I will gladly admit that I never got into Death. And at the time, a lot of it had to do with the vocal style. I have since gone back and listened to some stuff, and I like what I hear in a variety of songs. That being said, I chose Symbolic. Um, and I chose Symbolic because I went back in time and I looked at what we did on episode 51 for the death metal episode that we did. And our big four for that day was Death, the band Death's, their big four songs. And two of the four songs that I chose were from Symbolic. There was Crystal Mountain, that ended up being my number one song, as well as Symbolic, the song Symbolic itself. So that right there told me that if I'm listening to this album and I like two of the songs, on an album that I'm not really super familiar with overall, or I don't listen to on a regular basis whatsoever, that this should be the album for me. And I went and listened to it, and I'm like, yeah, it is. That's what it is for me. And here's the funny thing about that: if you out there have the 2008 remastered version, it has four demo songs. Actually, it has five, and on those five songs, or four out of the five songs, has Steve DiGiorgio playing bass on it. Although he ended up not recording the final product that ended up coming out on the album. Symbolic
Yeah.
has Chuck on vocals and guitar. It has a guy named Bobby Keeble on
Keeble.
Keeble. Okay, so Bobby Keeble on guitar, Kelly Conlon on bass, and then Gene Hoglan on drums. So, um, Gene and Chuck, stable part of that lineup at that point, and Gene's just like you said, amazing drummer, and Bobby and Kelly on guitar and bass respectively. So I would think there's almost kind of like Steve DiGiorgio wrote those bass lines, I guess,
He did. Yeah, he
right, and
was
so
he was involved with that
right.
pre-production part of
And
it.
Kelly ended up just basically playing those bass lines on the
And he's
album.
a great bass player. Don't get me wrong. Like if I was not to pick the individual thought patterns era, like that lineup, this would be the one that I would pick. So I mean, I think it's a fair choice.
No, so I mean, look, Individual Thought Patterns is one of the bigger albums from Death. Symbolic was one of the bigger albums from Death. I mean, basically, Individual Thought Patterns is basically what really. I mean, well, let me take it back. Human is what pushed them, into the for
Spotlight. Yeah.
spotlight. I was going to say it's definitely not in the mainstream, but it put him in the spotlight. And I
It
think
was
each.
it was the closest they got to the mainstream because they did appear on Beavis and Butthead because of the lack of comprehension.
So yes, that happened, and so they got into the stream of consciousness of metal fans that were not necessarily into that kind of music, and each album after that progressively, I guess, didn't sell as much, but they all sold something in the United States where before Human they didn't. There was just basic, underground type sales, and so they were. Individual Thought Patterns, very good album. Symbolic, very good album. Sound of Perseverance, very good album. All those, I think, progressively musically they got better, even though in general, you can't go by album sales, but in album sales they didn't. But I think each album, let me not say better, they grew with every album.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, here's the thing. Like, if looking back, you could get Steve DiGiorgio to actually record on Sound of Perseverance because again, he did preliminary work, but he didn't actually record on the album instead of Scott Clendenin. Now, I never enjoyed Scott's bass playing because I thought it was a step down from the previous guys. No offense to him and rest in peace. But I thought it was a step down because you have these great fretless bass players, establishing that kind of sound. A lot of bands would take that template, like say Obscura, and run with it after Death was gone. And I think had Steve DiGiorgio played on that album, that would possibly be the definitive lineup because Richard Christie, a lot of fans of
Howard Stern.
Howard Stern would know Richard Christie, but they don't know he is an amazingly skilled drummer. And yeah, so like that is also an option for that too, but still I got to go with my gut and go with, the one that I chose, the individual thought patterns lineup. So, a good choice as well.
I get that. And, like I said, for my limited amount of time that I listened to Death, I had to go with Symbolic. All right.
Understood.
So my turn now on the band that I'm going to pick. And the band I'm picking is Overkill. Now, Overkill is still around today. They have gone through a bajillion lineups. And the one lineup that I'm going to choose actually only played together on one album. So I did not go through the classic lineup that played in the 80s. I went to the one that started out the 90s. I went with the Horoscope lineup, which included Bobby the Blitz Ellsworth on lead vocals, Merritt Gant on guitars, Rob Canavino on guitars, Didi Verdi on bass, and Sid Falk on drums. Now, the reason I picked that album is because I think, even for themselves, I think that album, as they'd like to put it, kind of put them. That was, I think, their biggest selling album. It put them over the top for what they were at the time. Although for me, Taking Over was probably their definitive album as far as who Overkill was in the 80s. And then they progressed, with Years of Decay and stuff like that. But it was definitely Horoscope. I remember when that album came out, I got a promo copy because I was working at the record store, and it was absolutely 100% an awesome album. I literally had just started working at the store. No, I'm sorry. I started working in 1990, so I had been there a year. That album, when that album came out, and they did Coma, and then they did a cover of Frankenstein halfway through the album.
Edgar Winter.
Excuse me?
Edgar Winter.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's the Edgar Winter band, or Edgar Winter group, excuse me. A cover of Frankenstein, killer instrumental, and the running joke when that album was being promoted by the record label was, hey, they would see Bobby in the halls of the record company, and they're like, Bobby, you never sounded better. That's because it's an instrumental, so they would joke with him about his vocals. So that lineup, to me, the reason why I think it's their best lineup is because I think everything came together for them. Bobby Gustafson had left the band. He was the single guitar player, so he played all the rhythms, he played all the leads. And what ended up happening is when he left, it allowed Bobby and Didi to expand the band to a 5-piece, which they still are to this day, and allow them to have a lead and rhythm guitar player. And the
fuller sound.
Yeah, it's fuller. The two of them traded solos, so it was more, and for what it's worth, more democratic, I guess you could say that way. But that has nothing to do with anything really. Yeah, but much fuller sound. There was just a lot going on, and they stepped up the game on that album. Now, unfortunately, I believe Sid Falk ended up leaving after that album tour, or he may have left in the middle of the tour. I can't remember exactly how it went down, but he left, and then Tim Miller came on for the next 2 albums. So they had a stable lineup for the next 2 albums, which were I Hear Black and WFO, but those albums were just a step down from Horoscope. So that's why I kind of like Horoscope, because it was so definitive, and they went ahead and they did an anniversary live album in Germany and released it. They did one show. I don't know if it was 2 shows or 1 show, but they played the original Feel the Fire album in its entirety, and then they did Horoscope in its entirety. So that tells you how much they think about that album. So
okay, yeah, I mean, I can see that one for sure. But I went in a very different direction.
Why?
So my definitive, or my best lineup for Overkill is the 2005 to 2017 lineup. But with Bobby Blitz on vocals, Dave Lint on lead guitars, Derek Taylor on guitars, Didi Verni on bass, and Ron Lipnicki on drums. They put out 5 albums together: Immortalis, Iron Blood, Electric Age, White Devil Armory, and The Grinding Wheel. Most of my favorite songs from Overkill come from this era. I like that they have a harder edge. They kind of return to their thrash sound, kind of moving away from the groove, but still keeping the tone that they had from the groove era of the band. And just for me, like, I saw them during this time period for the first time, and that was when I started to kind of more take notice of them. Like, you're obviously much more of an Overkill fan than I am, but I've seen them, I think, 3 times now, and I mean, they sound even better to me, at least, than they did when they were in their heyday. So I think their harder edge really just brings that out for me, and some of the songs from this era I just think are much better.
I've seen Overkill twice, 32 years apart, 1988.
Oh,
and,
wow.
and then the last show that you and I went to before the world shut down in 2020.
Yeah,
Um,
that was the
I,
last concert that we went to before the pandemic started. Yeah.
right now, I got to go with you on this one. I mean, I do like this lineup. I do like the fact that they stayed together for so long. That would be my number 2 lineup. And then behind that, the classic lineup would be my number 3. Um, yeah, because this is like from really for me, it was from Ironbound on. I think Immortalis was good.
Hmm.
I do like a few songs off of it, but to me, Ironbound, it was almost like they found their their magic potion for writing again. Because even though Immortalis was only uh, well, actually, Immortalis was 3 years earlier from Ironbound. So I think when Ironbound came out, if you look at the pattern that they were going on, they were coming out with an album every couple of years, but between Immortalis and Ironbound, it was 3 years, and then
Yeah.
since that point, it was almost every 2 years, and then they took another break there right after White Devil Armory. But they just I think they found their songwriting groove. Ironbound was so much thrashier than Immortalis to me.
I agree. Immortalis still had some of that groove element to it. I mean,
Yeah,
they had that one track with Randy Blythe appearing on it. Was it Skull and Bones? And so there's a little bit of difference between the sound, but yes, Ironbound, they kind of reestablished what their sound was. Electric Age definitely carried it over. I think White Devil Armory was even better, and I really like Grinding Wheel. I think that was a really good album. So this lineup, I mean, mostly stayed the same even after. I think it was just Ron Lipnicki that left, and they replaced him with Jason Bittner at that point.
yeah,
So, and he's a
they got even
fantastic.
better.
Yeah, exactly. The material, though, I don't think. I mean, they've only put out 2 albums with that lineup, right? So it's only time will tell, and maybe that will be the definitive lineup. Who knows?
Who knows? I mean, they're enjoying themselves. They did great. They just had a free opening gig for Metallica when Metallica played New Jersey a few weeks back, or a few months ago, I guess you could say now.
Mhm.
At the I think it was the second show of the or maybe it was the first show of the first US show. I can't remember, of the M72 seasons tour, but that takeover weekend for Metallica, they had parking lot gigs, and um, Overkill was one of the bands, and what was the name of the other band? I can't remember now. Holy crap! It was Prong. That's right. So Prong. So literally, so one. I think it was so Metallica played Friday and Sunday. So I believe on Friday it was Overkill and Prong was on Sunday, or vice versa. Obviously, it was vice versa. But they played the days that Metallica were playing. They played live in the parking lot in the middle of the afternoon. So pretty cool.
All right.
Of course, all the comments were, you know, uh, Overkill should be playing inside. Metallica should throw a bone at those guys. It's long story. You don't. It
I
doesn't
mean,
work
they
that
should
way.
have brought Anvil, but we'll talk about
Anvil,
that later.
Anvil. All right, all right. What you got next?
So we're gonna talk about Testament and my what I believe to be the best lineup for Testament would be the 2014 through 2022 lineup of Chuck Billy on vocals, so Alex Skolnick on guitars, Eric Peterson on guitars, Steve DiGiorgio on bass, and Gene Hoglan on drums.
Now, what years did you say?
2014 to 2022.
2014 to 2022. Okay. All right, I got you.
Yeah, that would be when Steve DiGiorgio first joined to the time that Gene Hoglan left.
Right. Okay.
So they put out 2 albums during that time, from Brotherhood of the Snake and Titans of Creation, both of which I adore. I think both of those albums are fantastic. What I like about them is that they've become even heavier as time has gone on. I think Chuck Billy's vocals have only gotten better with time. He's gotten heavier, more growly. They've taken all the elements of all the different things they tried to do. Say with Demonic, which Steve DiGiorgio also appeared on. I'm sorry, which Gene Hoglan also appeared on. Brought in that heavier drumming. And then some of the stuff, they were a little bit more experimental in the mid part of their career. They took all the good things and brought it in, and then they kept all the amazing things from their early formation into this era of the band. I think, to me, it's the heaviest era that they've ever had. Their rhythm section has never been better. No offense to anybody before, but these guys just have a synergy together, and they bring that skill. Like, it broke my heart when Gene Hoglan said he was leaving, but I understand. I mean, he's done several other projects since, including coming back to Death Clock, which I'm so happy about. So, and then hearing their older material with this lineup is so much heavier, even. So, like, I really like this lineup. I wish it had continued longer, but I'll take what we got.
I enjoy this lineup a lot. But unfortunately for me, that's not the lineup that really sticks with me. And for me, it's more about the classic lineup and why I got into Testament to begin with. So I go all the way back to 1987 all the way through 1992, which is the classic lineup that includes Chuck Billy on vocals, Eric Peterson on guitars, Alex Skolnick on guitars, Greg Christian on bass, and Louis Clementi on drums. That was the lineup that put them on the map. They got better and better with each album. Then they got to the Ritual. They wanted to be a little bit more commercial. And I really think that was a record company pushing them to go that way.
I would say most likely,
And then
yeah.
on top of that, Alex Skolnick was starting to flake out and he wanted to do jazz. So he ended up leaving the band. And then the band tried to do a little bit of more groove oriented, kind of bring in a little bit of grunge to their sound, and they released Low. So that Low is when Alex Skolnick had already left, and they brought in James Murphy to play guitar, and it was okay. I mean, Low, I love the song Low, but the album itself just wasn't all that. But I do like the Brotherhood of the Snake and Titans of Creation lineup that you're talking about. Um, and when Gene Hoglan left, they replaced him with Dave Lombardo, which was a basically a reunion of the Gathering lineup. And well, except for James Murphy was part of the Gathering, so there was the Gathering. What do we call that? Rhythm section. So
Yeah.
and so it's all right. I prefer the whole Dave Lombardo thing. I thought it was cool, but when you go from Gene Lombardo, from Gene Hoglan to Dave Lombardo, um, and this is no slight on Dave. Gene's just so far above almost everybody else,
And
right? Dave has a different groove.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I would disagree with you. Like, I don't think Dave Lombardo is lesser of a drummer by any means, and that's probably not what you meant. But what I think Dave has is he has his own style. And
Mhm,
like,
right.
say for instance, like those early Slayer albums, like Dave brings something to Slayer that nobody else has. And you just, no taken away from what's his name? Uh, no
Louis
taken
Philippe.
away from Paul Bostaph,
Oh,
but
right.
Dave Lombardo is such an integral part of that early Slayer sound. Like, you just can't deny it. But yes, you go from Gene, who is just this amazingly technically proficient drummer who just has speed beyond 99% of drummers, and then you bring in Dave, who has more of like a jazzy, you know, he has this
He's
feel
got a
to him.
groove to him. He's got a
There's a
very
Exactly. Like, it's such a weird step because, like, think about the things that they recorded with Gene and the band. They're so fast, they're so technical, they're heavy. And it just, to me, it was like, what are they doing?"
right. And like I said, it's no slight to Dave because obviously Dave can do the material.
Oh,
It's
for sure.
very different. And it's funny because I remember when they were recording Brotherhood of the Snake, they said, Gene said to Chuck, he say, "Look, what do you want me to play? Because if I play the way I play, then the guy who comes in after me, if that ever comes down to it, is not going to be able to play it."
Hmm.
And Chuck and Eric told him, "You play you do what you do, and we'll worry about that later on." You know, and so that's what makes those albums so good. I mean, his drumming is on Dark Roots of the Earth, Brotherhood of Snake, and Titans of Creation, just outstanding. You know,
For sure.
and I for me personally, Dark Roots of the Earth is probably my favorite Testament album out of them all. But and I was listening to Brotherhood of the Snake the other day, and that's such a good album as well. The whole thing is that he left, and then Dave comes in. Now, mind you, Dave only ended up doing the tour, and they now have another dude in the band who,
Christovus.
yeah, Christovus, who is young kid, right? But he's probably got the same kind of energy that Gene Hoglan has, right? And he has the technical proficiency, and he just wants to be the best drummer out there. So I think they didn't lose anything. I think they get another a newer energy because he is younger. They just get this energy that's probably going to push them over the top as far as their songwriting is concerned
Yeah, I
on
can't
the
wait to
next
see
album.
where they go. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
All
so
right.
yeah.
So who do you got next?
All right. So next for me is going to be Wasp. Um, Wasp, as everybody knows, is still around today. Another band that has been through the early '80s all the way until now, and for the most part, I guess maybe the last 20 years of their career has mostly been focused on Europe. They don't do a lot of stuff in the United States. They did just recently do a 40th anniversary tour in the US. It was a phenomenal success for the band, for Blackie. Um, and it was an underground grassroots reason why that tour ended up being successful and being able to happen. It was like almost like a challenge. Blackie put it out there, hey, for all the fans in the United States, they telling me that we can't sell out venues. And all of a sudden, you know, Blackie said, if the promoters have put it together, you guys need to come, and they came. I mean, they played. They weren't big venues; they were small clubs, but regardless, it was packed, and the shows were great. You and I went to it last year.
Yeah, it
Last
was
year,
phenomenal.
it was
Yeah,
awesome.
really
You know,
enjoyed it.
it's unfortunate that Blackie's hurt his back right now and had to cancel the second part of the North American tour after they came back from Europe. So, but anyway, um, my best, what I think is their best lineup. Now they're another band who never had the same lineup twice until more of the recent albums, but in their heyday, they had different lineup changes on just about every album. So their Second album, The Last Command, to me is their definitive lineup. Um, and that includes Blackie Lawless on lead vocals and bass, Chris Holmes on guitars, Randy Piper on guitars, and Stephen Riley on drums. Stephen Riley, our favorite drummer from LA Guns. um, that
I mean, you can't take away he's a good drummer.
he's,
Okay.
he's serviceable. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, look, he wouldn't be there this long. He's a songwriter. He's a drummer. He's been around for a long time. So no, he's a good drummer. I'll put it that way. He's no Gene Hoglan though.
Fair.
But they put together The Last Command. So the big lineup change from there was getting Stephen Riley when they let go of Tony Richards from the first album. And what's curious about this is that Blackie Lawless is actually a guitar player, and he's a guitar player now. They have bass players in the band now. And the next album, Inside the Electric Circus, Randy Piper left, and so Blackie took over rhythm guitars, and they brought in Johnny Rod on bass. That was my number 2 choice because I was pretty close with that because I loved that album as well. But The Last Command, I just remember listening to that album when it came out over and over and over again. It's not better than the first one, but it's so different because it's so well produced, and then the next one is more polished, but this one is well produced. I just thought that this was really, for me, their definitive lineup, because Randy Piper's still on there and playing rhythm guitars, and Chris Holmes is just ripping it and shredding it on that album. And Blackie's doing Blackie. So I thought this was a very good album. It has my favorite song from Wasp, which is the Wild Child. So I had to give it that.
Okay. Well, this would be the first one that we actually matched up on.
Ooh, look at that.
So the reason being is my favorite Wasp album is the original by far. That being said, my number 2 Wasp album is Last Command. But the thing about the first album, and knowing more about the band, having watched, documentaries and interviews and stuff like that, Blackie never felt like Tony Richards was the right drummer. He was very critical of him. He, made him re-record and re-record and re-record things. They would edit a lot of the stuff he did. So, knowing that, and knowing that, like, when Steve Riley came into the band, he didn't have to do that kind of stuff. He felt more comfortable with him as the drummer. And that was, a longer period of time. It was from 84 to 86. And so having that, knowing and Steve Riley stayed on till 87 even too. So, like, other than changing, Johnny Rod and Randy Piper at that point. But I think what's interesting to me is that, like, having that level of comfort, having the ability to, function more effectively, I think is what makes that particular lineup even better. Also, Steve Riley is a good drummer. He drama with LA Guns aside, like, when I think of Steve Riley, I tend to think of him as a Wasp drummer. So I think, for me, like, I really thought about it, and I almost went with the original album the original album lineup, just because I like that album better. But then I thought, like, from a standpoint of how the band functioned and what they achieved after, I think it was a better choice.
I mean, I can see that point. I mean, Tony Richards, I know there was a lot of stuff, that went on, that went down with him. And Chris Holmes to this day says that if Tony Richards leaving the band was the sign that Blackie Lawless was taking over.
Yes, that's true.
And you know what? I don't buy it. I think from the beginning, this has always been Blackie's project, and it's always, when you put a band together, I don't think this one didn't come together organically like a lot of young bands come together. I mean, Blackie Lawless was already an experienced veteran of the music business. He had played, he was in and out of the New York Dolls in a flash. He knew, he was uh, associated with Kiss at some point, and it's one of those weird things. So when he moved to LA, and then he hooked up with Nikki Sixx, and so he wasn't a fresh young face. He wasn't this, he wasn't an Eddie Van Halen. He wasn't a Randy Rhoads starting in the scene. He already been there, done that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But he wanted his fame and fortune. He wanted his piece of the pie too. And so I think that Wasp was his baby, and it's always been his baby. And since it wasn't as organic as Chris Holmes would like to make it seem, it was always going to be the Blackie show. And when it finally came down to it, that's what it's been. So,
Yep.
and Tony was the first piece of the puzzle to fall. So it is what it is. I mean, I like I like Stephen Riley, the albums that he's on. Like I said, I love Last Command. I love Inside Electric Circus. I absolutely adore the first album. And that Stephen's not on there, but those are the three defining Wasp albums for me. And Stephen Riley's happens to be on two of them. So like I said, like you and I agree, The Last Command is their definitive album or definitive lineup.
Yeah.
So, you're up next with what?
My next band is going to be Megadeth.
Megadeth. Oh, this is going to be a good one.
So, for me, it was, I had to think about it because there are two lineups that I would consider, kind of my favorites. But I really thought about it, and there's a factor of this one that puts them over the edge. And that would be the 1990 to 1998 lineup of Dave Mustaine on lead vocals and guitars, Marty Friedman on guitars, Dave Ellefson on bass, and Nick Menza on drums. They put out Rust in Peace, Countdown to Extinction, Euthanasia. They did the Hidden Treasures compilation, which featured those four members as well. And Cryptic Writings was the last of this lineup. So one big factor is Countdown to Extinction. This was number 2 on the US Billboard 200. That was a huge, a win for Megadeth. They had 3 platinum albums during this time with Rust in Peace, Euthanasia, and obviously Countdown to Extinction. And this would really be Megadeth's boom period, the largest mainstream appeal they ever achieved. This was also their longest lasting lineup. Now, that may change in the next few years. We'll see. We don't know what's going to go on with Kiko, if, he's just taking some time off, etc., but we'll see. But I think a lot of people, when they think of Megadeth, would associate obviously Dave Ellefson, but also Marty Friedman. He had that much of an impact. He was such an amazing guitarist. His work on really all of these albums, but specifically Rest in Peace for me, just really puts things over the top. Like he is such a great member of that band. I'm so glad they've done these shows, and you can watch them online where he appeared and played with them as well. And then obviously Nick Menza, rest in peace, great drummer, fit the band perfectly at that time. This was really when they came into their own. I obviously, those early years, especially with Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? That's my second favorite Megadeth album. That was a great lineup as well, with Gar Samuelson and
Chris Poland.
and Chris Poland. But this to me is just that definitive lineup. Like, they had the most success during that time. Some of the best players they ever played with, and it just I couldn't choose anything otherwise.
Well, in this particular case, I have to agree with you. I chose the same lineup. I chose it for the pretty much the same reasons. I mean, it was as it was the defining lineup in their career. Um, Today's lineup is, I think, finally Dave is satisfied with the guitar player he has. But I, I mentioned this to you a couple weeks ago. Now that they've Kiko's had to step aside for family reasons, and this guy Timo has come into the band. Man, you know, I have a feeling that something's going to happen with Kiko, and he's going to be out. That's just my gut, but I hope not, because I really think that Kiko is the best fit for the band, um, in long term and and short term. But I just I don't know, man. When Dave starts heaping praise, the guy before him always goes down the tubes, and I don't know.
We'll
I
see. We'll
you
see.
know so I hope not, because I really believe that Kiko's place should be in Megadeth. He fits and complements Dave so well, that's part of the reason why I hope there is no change. I think Dirk as a drummer um, fits absolutely great. He When he took over for Chris Adler, I had hoped that Chris Adler would have stayed in Megadeth, and I think Dave originally had hoped, but when you bring in a guy like Dirk, it's kind of like, yeah, this guy's pretty damn good too. So so many lineup changes for Megadeth, but it was really nice to see, after kind of almost growing up with Megadeth, because I mean I picked up on Megadeth after or during P Cells, and knowing, like, for me, there was the P Cells lineup, then the lineup changed for So Far So Good So What, and then the lineup changed again. I'm like saying, what's are they rainbow? What's going on here? And to see that with Rust in Peace and Countdown and Euthanasia, that they stuck it together, and they were able to write really classic music. That was something that, like, I didn't like seeing bands change members all the time. I thought that was weird. I didn't think that's the way it was supposed to go.
See,
So,
I had such a different perspective because like I grew up and after you, right? Like I came about during I was born in 86. So when I was born, for me Metallica was Jason Newsted, right? Like, you know, it wasn't long after it might have even been before I was born when Cliff died. Um
but your
so
birthday's when?
August.
So he died a month after you.
Yeah. So, that's all I ever knew. But I go back and I read these inserts from the albums, and I go like, who's this guy Mustaine? And that's how I figured out Megadeth. And I remember being a kid and listening to the Eagles. And my parents would talk about the Eagles and their lineup at the time, and then I'd go back and I'd be like, well, who's this guy Randy Meisner, and who's this guy um, Bernie Leadon? Like I didn't know these things. Like, so for me, I just always had this interest in how bands would change and these lineup changes. Like, and that's kind of what spurred on this episode, where it just sometimes I just think about that. Like, it's very interesting. It's always been something that, like, when I look at the Black Sabbath lineup and how many changes they had, like, it was always just something that really interested me. So, I had a little bit of a different perspective. Like, I don't like it when they change, but at the same time, I'm fascinated by it.
And it's weird because, like, I went through the Iron Maiden changes,
Hmm.
which we're gonna maybe get to in a little bit. Um, I went through the Kiss changes. Kiss, I grew up with Kiss, is my favorite band for a long period of time, and I've known them, and we'll talk about them in a little bit as well. I went through, uh, you know, well, I went. I mean, I was a Twisted Sister fan, and they changed drummers, and I was, you know, an Ozzy fan, and Ozzy, had to change guitar players, and then all of a sudden, bass player in, bass player out, drummer in, drummer out. It was just one of these things to me. For when it comes to your favorite band, it's almost disheartening.
Oh, for
You know,
sure. Yeah.
like I remember I was working at not an IT company. I was working for in IT for a telecommunications company, and I remember the day that Jason Newsted quit Metallica. And I'm like, "What the fuck?" I mean, at that point, I said to myself, "Is the band gonna be able to continue?" Because I thought Jason was Metallica, and not obviously James and Lars are Metallica, but I just thought that he was the kind of the glue that held it together because he was so metal compared to the rest of them at that point. They had
Yeah.
gone through their alternative phase, if you want to look at it that way, but Jason never strayed, you know. As much as he was in the band and he recorded the albums in concert, he never strayed. He was just so much energy. And I was just devastated. I was kind of like, what the hell's going on with my favorite band? Kiss changing guitar players all the time. It was one of those weird things. And so um, all those things happening, even like in Pearl Jam, I was a big Pearl Jam fan and they changed drummers. And I'm like, really? And then they got Jack Irons. And I'm like, the guy from Red Hot Chili Peppers? And then when they got Jack Irons, they changed their whole sound changed. And I'm like, I don't like this shit, you know. So and then Megadeth changing all the time. I was like, come on, man. But I get it. Is a fascination, but and I like it when you have to go back and look at it, sort of like with Rainbow, which we're going to talk about later. You go back and you see the lineup changes and you hear the albums and you say, okay, but when you're in the middle of it, it's disheartening because you're in the middle of it. You've grown to like those 4 or 5 guys that are in the band.
Yeah.
And, you
Well,
know
it's like a TV show, right? Like when you see the cast changes. And I remember being a kid and watching. It's weird. Most kids watch the cartoons and stuff, and I did. Don't get me wrong, but I would watch a lot of Law and Order, and so, and so they would play replays, and there would be like different people on sometimes, right? And I did like as a little kid, 5, 6 years old, you don't necessarily grasp the concept of you know different seasons and stuff like that, like at least initially. And so I remember like seeing different people, like different detectives and different lawyers on the show and stuff like that, and being like, why is it different people, and that was the same with music. I'd be like, what happened? Why did these things happen? Like why did they change? And I was always just so fascinated with that. I just and then you learn it's egos, or somebody got fired for drug use or something like that. And it's just interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I've always thought that way too, but when you're in the middle of it, it's kind of rough,
Oh yeah.
like
Yeah,
you're
for
losing a
sure.
family member, not in that regards, but not in death, but you're losing a best friend kind of thing. And then, but if when you go back and you say, oh, look, Rainbow had 10 different lineups for 10 different albums, then you say that, oh, okay. And it's interesting to read about, and why that happened. So, all right. Where are we moving on to? You did Megadeth. So it's my turn, right?
Yes,
So
sir.
I'm going to talk about Anthrax. And Anthrax, again, another band that is still around today, started in the early mid 80s. For me, the lineup that I would consider the best lineup for Anthrax is the lineup that goes from 1984 to 1992, which is the classic lineup of Joey Belladonna on lead vocals, Scott Ian on rhythm guitars, Danny Spitz on lead guitars, Frank Bello on bass, and Charlie Benante at drums. They recorded 4 albums together, Spreading the Disease, Among the Living, State of Euphoria, Persistence of Time, as well as a couple different EPs, especially the Armed and Dangerous EP, which I really, really like that version of Armed and Dangerous, which I heard is supposed to be the same version, it's the same recording, but remixed. I'm like, that's a completely different remix. I mean, it sounds completely different. And to sit there and say, "Oh, that's the same version, just remix," I don't know, but that's a hell of a remix if it is. Um, I think that I mean that established a band, and to me, there's a reason why Joey's singing today. They came back to Joey, but we've gone through the differences between Joey and John and why John's not here and all that stuff. And I think if John never leaves or if they never do the reunion, I think John is still playing in Anthrax and he's going back and forth between Anthrax and Armored Saint. And Joey would be out. But that's my opinion. That's what I think. But but history is what it is, and John's not there anymore. I think it goes back to it had to be Joey, and it had to be this for me. It had to be this period of time and this lineup as being the best lineup for Anthrax.
Okay. Okay. Well, so mine is a little different. Mine is going to be the lineup of Dan Nelson, Scotty, and no, I'm just kidding. So,
You had me going there.
so no, I actually picked the same lineup as you. So my personal favorite Anthrax album is Sound of White Noise. Um, the reason why I don't think that lineup is going to be the best. Well, first of all, they only did one album, but even the stuff that came after, right, with Paul Crook on lead guitar, um, they really did not have support from their record label. And that started with Sound of White Noise, with their misleading them on the way they should have released their singles, other things like that. Then having to move over to different record labels, having issues with those record labels, being dropped or them going out of business or whatever happened, and they never got the chance to get their feet under them. Whereas the original, not the original, but the classic lineup of Joey Belladonna on vocals with the other, with let's say, Scotty and Dan Spitz, Frank Bello, and Charlie Benante. Obviously, they had the most success, and that's basically the lineup today, minus Dan Spitz. And that's the reason they're able to persevere, like you said. Like, they basically reunited to the classic lineup, and still put on shows, and they're still mostly playing stuff off of Among the Living.
Yeah.
So it's they had 3 gold records during that time, which is the most success they ever had. And I would say their biggest hits come from this era. Like just it being one album that really is super strong, again, with Sound of White Noise, does not push that era over them, the massive success they had from 1984 to 1992. So, as much as I would love to pick, the 92 to 95 era, it just made more sense to go with this one for me.
I think if Anthrax were actually to do an accounting of all their old record sales, I think that Spreading the Disease would go gold. And I think Among the Living would be platinum because I can't understand how it's not.
Yeah, I mean, it seems odd to me.
I mean, I can understand why State of Euphoria and Persistence are gold, but I can't see how Among the Living is not platinum. But it's a process, and you have to pay for it. And I believe they're just not willing to go through that, which is fine, But when you look at I'm looking at the record sales for worship music, And when you look at that, and it's sold 110,000 copies at the time in 2011, that's a lot. That was a huge album comeback for them. With the
Yeah,
reunion, with
it's a
bringing
really
Joey
good
back.
album. Yeah.
Oh, it's an awesome album. It's an awesome album. I mean, and I like what they've been doing. I'm sad that they weren't able to keep a Rob, Caggiano in the band, but John Denai fits so well, and he's been such a good addition to the sound of Anthrax that it was almost seamless, you know. And
Yeah.
I'm glad he's still in it, and hey, it's a paying gig. I mean, I don't think the guy's going anywhere, considering Shadows Fall is only playing one or two reunion shows a year. So it's a good gig for him, and it's a good paying gig. I'm pretty sure. So, all right, what do you got next?
So the last one that I'm going to go over today is Iron Maiden. And I am picking their 1982 to 1990 lineup of Bruce Dickinson on vocals, Dave Murray and Adrian Smith on guitars, Steve Harris on bass, and Nico McBrain on drums. Now, as I've said on previous episodes, my favorite drummer is Clive Burr. They only put out one album, and I think it's both of our favorite album. But you can't deny the success they had with this lineup. They put out Peace of Mind, Power Slave, Somewhere in Time, and Seventh Son of Seventh Son. That's 3 platinum albums. This would be what you would consider their big stadium tour lineup. This lineup basically still plays today when they reunited in 1999 with the addition of Yannick Gers. Now, he was in the band at the time. They technically reunited with Bruce and Adrian Smith. But this is basically the classic lineup with an addition of one. Peace of Mind is a massive album. The Trooper, I think most people know, even if you're not a big fan of Iron Maiden. Power Slave, to me, is one of my favorite albums from the band. Somewhere in Time is one of those that crisscrosses for my favorite album as well. And Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, to me, is like the end of an era, because not only was it the last album that featured Adrian Smith, the 2 albums that followed, and then obviously the Blaze era, were a step down, multiple steps down. And Seventh Son still carried over that spirit and that quality that they had. So even though Number of the Beast is my favorite album from the band, and I do think it stands out, and I wish there was an alternate history where Clive Burr had stayed in the band. I think he was a phenomenal drummer, brought something really interesting to the table, and that's no slight to Nico, because he is also a phenomenal drummer. I love his attitude. I love not understanding a word he says, and he hilarious. But there's just something about that magic that's on Number of the Beast to me that makes it the best. But this era with Nico is just that much more impactful.
I had obviously we have lots of options with the band lineups of Iron Maiden, and so many people sit there and say, "Oh, well, if it doesn't have Paul Diano in it, I'm not going to listen to it." And like, obviously, I haven't listened to Iron Maiden in 41 years, but I have to agree with you in this particular case. Iron Maiden, that classic lineup from Peace of Mind all the way through Seventh Son, there's no denying that is the definitive classic lineup of that band. Thankfully, they're still together today, and they added Yannick as because we already had a full sound. We're going to have a fuller sound. you know, so and I just saw like Steve Harris sits and say, I always wished we had three guitar players, and I'm sitting there thinking, why? One plays rhythm, one plays lead. So now you got 2 rhythms, and then you throw in Steve, who doesn't play your typical bass, and that's literally like 4 rhythms going on at one time. I mean, I can understand, like, I know you say you can hear all the different complex things, with Brave New World, that it's almost kind of annoying to you.
Yeah, I think it's too much. I think three guitarists is too much, and I hate to say that. I like all three guys, but if it were my personal choice, I would condense it down to two guitars. But that being said, I'm more than happy with what they're doing because they love it. They love playing together. There's nothing but good vibes, and I'm happy with that. So.
Right. Yeah. And look, it's the same lineup, just added another guitar player. I mean, I was real close to picking the Number of the Beast lineup with Clive Burr. There's something about his playing that is just so outstanding. Everyone talks about it. I mean, Metallica's last 2 albums, Lars has said, that he chooses his fills based on Clive's style, and you could hear it all over Hardwired. He's expanded it a little bit more on 72 Seasons, but you can tell that Hardwired, he was really going out of his way to be like Clive, in that Clive did a lot of fills with the snare drum. Didn't do a lot of tom work. I mean, he did obviously on like Run to the Hills, but he didn't do a lot of tom work overall, and that's what Lars was trying to replicate in Hardwired to Self Destruct. But I almost chose it just because of Clive's drumming, but I had to go with Nico because of the fact that it was him who solidified the lineup. When he came on board, it was that those or those 4 albums in a row. I mean, you can't get more classic than that. I mean, they didn't let up. And even, when although No Prayer for the Dying, there was a slight regress, it was still a very good album. Some pretty shitty songs on it, but still a very good album. I'm like you get decent songs and you get bad songs. So Fear of the Dark is the same way. But it wasn't like horrible, like, oh, I got to throw this out. This is the worst Iron Maiden shit ever. It wasn't that bad. It was just different because they almost kind of went back to their old sound. There was not a lot of the keyboards, not a lot of the synthy sound. They kind of stripped it back out. But that the Peace of Mind, Power Slave, Somewhere in Time, Seventh Son, classic lineup that you cannot deny with Iron Maiden.
Agreed.
Okay, so that brings us to our last band that we're going to talk about tonight, and that is Kiss. So this one is tricky for me because I could have gone the Chris Jericho route, which is the 80s. But even in the 80s, is which 80s are we talking? Which 80s lineup are we talking about? There is a definitive 80s lineup, which is from 84 and a half on to up to 1991. Or, there's also the Creatures of the Night, which is, pick your guitar player, but the rest of the band's the same. Or, you can go with the classic lineup that basically made Kiss who they are. And I went with the classic lineup that made Kiss who they are. I was very surprised at me choosing that, only because I've been kind of harsh with my criticism of Peter Criss, but there's no denying that those 4 guys have a chemistry. That chemistry worked until 1 or 2 of the guys thought they were bigger than the band. And to this day, they have proven that they're not. So the lineup of Paul Stanley on vocals and rhythm guitar, Gene Simmons on bass, vocals and bass guitar, Ace Frehley on vocals and lead guitar, and Peter Criss on vocals and drums, to me is their definitive lineup, their best lineup. What they have now is probably their most skilled lineup. What they had in the 80s was probably one of their most skilled lineups, but this is the lineup that had the magic. And there's a big difference. You can have talent up the wazoo, Mark St. John, but if it doesn't come across, it doesn't have any soul behind it, you don't have much. And that was part of Mark St. John's problem. He didn't really have good touch. He didn't have soul behind his guitar solos. It was just a million notes fast. Him and Vinny, a million notes, no real depth
I
to it.
think Vinny had a lot more soul.
Oh, he had more. He had much more than Mark St. John, but he's also one of these guys that just had it's always been about a million notes and not about the song. And that's which is weird because Vinny wrote really good songs for Kiss.
He did.
Couldn't do it for himself.
I think he was broken after Kiss, so like that's a whole another subject for another day. But I mean, I think it really did. I think it broke him. A lot of the things that followed obviously did too, in his personal life.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about Vinnie Vincent and Mark St. John, that's two different categories almost because I mean, Mark had issues with the other members of the band. Never played anything the same way twice, and that just didn't fit the cookie cutter aspect of what like Gene and Paul were all about. So I mean, completely different things. But I will agree, like for me, that I picked the same lineup. There's hit album after hit album. Definitely their most platinum albums, most influential version of the band. Like how many people dress up as Kiss, out there? They're part of the Kiss army. They don't have Kiss coffins that just have the mass or the unpainted era of the band.
Imagine that. I'm gonna go get buried with Vinnie Vincent's face on my.
or like check out my Bruce Kulick coffin. Like it doesn't happen. Because they're not the characters, right? Like they did the movie during the Kiss versus the Phantom of the Park, or not versus. What was it called?
Kiss meets the Phantom of the
Kiss
Park.
meets the Phantom. Turned it into a Godzilla movie. But yeah, I mean, this was the biggest thing, right? And the band now currently mirrors what they were doing then. They're wearing the makeup, they're playing the characters, and they wouldn't have the success that they have now had they not done that, like gone back to wearing the makeup. So, like, Kiss, like when people think of Kiss, like if you're not the biggest fan, there are people, I guarantee you, there are people that still think it's Ace and Peter on stage.
Well, the thing about that is, I don't know if they think it's Ace and Peter, but they know it's the Catman and the Space Ace.
That's what I mean. Like they don't even probably know the names of everybody.
No,
But
I mean the general fan doesn't know shit. They just know that there's a guy up there wearing a bunch of silver, and there's a guy up there that looks like a cat. And they don't care as long as it sounds good.
Yeah.
I almost chose the lineup with Eric Carr and Bruce Kulick that basically wrote Asylum. Was it
Crazy Nights,
and then Hot in the Shade. I almost did that lineup because to me that was a definitive lineup. I mean, Bruce Kulick came on during the tour for Animalize, so he didn't play on the album, but he was on that tour. So he's been with the band since at that point. He was from '84 to 1990. Well, Bruce was there till '95. And then they just changed from one Eric to another Eric.
He left in '96, actually.
Oh, the '96. I didn't know what year they ended that part of the because I know they did the reunion
in '96. Yeah,
they did the not unmasked, the unplugged in '95.
Yes.
So I didn't know if it was the end of '95 or beginning of '96 when they finally decided to reunite. So I almost picked that version of the band because I think that's like I said, that's the Chris Jericho version. That's what he grew up on, and that was a really fruitful time period for Kiss. Although they were kind of like a half a step behind with the whole hair metal thing, that happened in the 80s, they still, at least they were able to reestablish themselves, and they actually put out some good songs. and that's with the help of the fact, that Bruce was very he was a very good he was very good at putting together very tasteful solos. And I think that's what helps him become such a good guitar player for Kiss, because he understood what Paul and Gene wanted, and he executed it with extreme precision, and yet was still had a ton of soul behind it. And that's what I liked about Bruce. He could play just like Mark, he could play just like Vinny, but he didn't have to, and he didn't.
Yeah.
But nothing beats the original lineup. Ace Frehley. I mean, he put together some very good he puts together some very good memorable solos. Okay. Peter
And it
Criss.
influenced a lot of people. How many guitarists out there go, I play guitar because of Ace Frehley?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, Dimebag, Daryl, Scott Ian, so many big names out there who play because of Ace Frehley. I mean, you know, it's a lesser influence, but Kirk Hammett was influenced by Ace Frehley, you know. So I had to go with that lineup for that reason. Look at the albums: Kiss, Hotter Than Hell, Dressed to Kill, Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun. Even though there was some hints and cracks in the walls, and didn't play all of the stuff, and Gene didn't play all his bass, and you know, um, Peter didn't play drums on Dynasty except for one song, didn't play at all on Unmasked. It's still, when you look at it, it
still that
still
era
says,
of the band, yeah.
right, it still says Peter, Ace, Paul, and Gene. So,
And even Psycho Circus, right? Like, they didn't play on all of it, but I mean, if you're including this lineup of the band, it's 1973 to 1980, and then 96 to 2001. I mean, essentially. I
right.
mean, they had a reunion with that same lineup, so technically it's part of the same lineup.
Correct. So, as funny as it is, when you and I don't check our notes, we end up having a lot of crossover.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had about 50% crossover and 50% disagreement. So, I
Yeah,
mean, it's interesting, but I think that shows some of these bands, like their impact in a certain era is pretty definitive. Like
absolutely.
yeah, it's hard to deny that the biggest impact that Kiss would have would be their original era. Whereas I think other bands, it's easier to kind of disagree on. So.
Absolutely correct. All right. We're up to the big four, and so we're going to continue on the topic of best lineups. We're choosing tonight's big four of Rainbow lineups. So Rainbow, another band that did not have the same lineup record one album or record consecutive albums. Every single album had a different lineup, and that was mostly due to Richie Blackmore's ego, as well as Richie Blackmore's uh, what's the word I'm trying to get? His pursuit of perfection in that regards. He always wanted to be better and always felt that he can get another guy who is better. So, um, let's see. I think you went first last time, so I'm going to go ahead and go first this time.
Okay.
All right. So for me, my number four best Rainbow lineup is going to be the ever growing, ever more popular Rainbow Rising lineup, which included Ronnie James Dio on vocals, Richie Blackmore on guitar, Jimmy Bain on bass, Tony Carey on keyboards, and Cozy Powell on drums. Um, you know, most people in the rock scene know who Cozy Powell is. Um, Everyone knows that Dio and Jimmy Bain were in the band Dio, and obviously everybody knows Richie Blackmore from Rainbow and Deep Purple. Tony Carey's is the odd man out in terms of fame, but I'm very familiar with Tony and some of the solo work that he did. He had a nice hit single on MTV called "Fine Fine Day." I really enjoy that song. That was, and I say ever growing popular lineup because there's a lot of people going back and listening to early Rainbow and realizing how good the early stuff was, and just absolutely enjoying the early Dio stuff on Rainbow, and not realizing that there was that much early. So I mean, those 3 albums were pretty good. So um, that's why I said it was ever growing in popularity. Number 3 for me is the difficult. Excuse me. Number 3 for me is the Down to Earth lineup that includes Graham Bonnet on vocals, Richie Blackmore on guitars, Roger Glover on bass, Don Airy on keyboards, and Cozy Powell on drums. That's pretty much between that and uh, another album I'm going to talk about in a few. That was the first I heard of Rainbow. That was the first time I saw what Rainbow was like, and yes, I saw Rainbow, and I see this video of what's that song that they had? Jesus Christ,
Since You've Been Gone.
no, All Night Long. You know, since I saw the video for All Night Long, and I see this guy with short hair and a skinny tie, he looks very 80s, even though the album came out in the 70s, and then or was it 70 or 79, and then you see Joe Lynn Turner, it's a different singer, and I'm like, what's going on here? Same band, but it was just a different album, and I love that album. Down to Earth is a very good album. It just did not do what Richie wanted it to do, and that was commercial crossover appeal. Even though they tried with the song Since You Begun, and they had a hit, but it didn't really push them over the top. The next album, number 2 for me, is Difficult to Cure. That's when they brought in Joe Lynn Turner on vocals, Richie Blackmore on bass, Richie Blackmore on guitar, Roger Glover on bass, Don Airy on keyboards, but they changed drummers. Now they brought in Bobby Rondinelli, and he was very different from Cozy Powell. Cozy Powell definitely being a better drummer, but Rondinelli being more of a double bass kind of drummer, if you want to look at it that way. And then finally, number 1 for me is the Straight Between the Eyes lineup, which included Joe Lynn Turner, Richie Blackmore, Roger Glover. They changed keyboardists. Don Airy was out and Dave Rosenthal was in, and they still had Bobby Rondinelli on drums. That to me is the classic Rainbow lineup. That is what I basically my love for Rainbow grew from that lineup on. So there we have it.
Well, it's a good list, but it's wrong.
Says you.
No, just kidding. But mine is a bit different, but we do have some crossover. My number 4 is Down to Earth. That's the Graham Bonnet album you mentioned. Like you said, there's some really good songs on there. Since You've Been Gone, I think was the first one that I heard with that lineup, and I really like that song. All Night Long is really good as well. And I think Graham Bonnet has a great voice, massively different than what I had first heard from them. But it was a very successful album. And over time, this one really grew on me. My number 3 is the Long Live Rock and Roll era. And that would be Ronnie James Dio, Richie Blackmore, Bob Daisley on bass, David Stone on keyboards, and Cozy Powell on drums. I really like this album. It's not my favorite, but for me, like the first half of the album and then Kill the King, I think is really solid. And that band, they had a lot of strife, a lot of, things going on. Obviously, Dio was on the way out. But it still has, anything with Cozy Powell. Cozy Powell is a great drummer. Bob Daisley, if you're a fan of Ozzy Osbourne, the best stuff that Ozzy ever put out had Bob Daisley on it. Still a great lineup, but definitely not the best. And then my number 2 is the Straight Between the Eyes lineup with Joe Lynn Turner on vocals, obviously Richie Blackmore on guitar, Roger Glover on bass, Dave Rosenthal on keyboards, and Bobby Rondinelli on drums. I had always, I started on the Dio era of the band, and then the next thing that I heard was I was watching, I want to say it was VH1 Classic, and the video for Death Alley Driver came on. And I was like, oh, wow, it's Rainbow. And then I heard Joe Lynn Turner sing, and I was like, that's not Ronnie James Dio. And it sparked my interest in finding out more of the band. And I really like this album. I think it's very strong. It's probably one of their best of this era. And it's a completely different concept than the Dio era. Being more mainstream, but Joe Lynn Turner is a great singer still to this day. Even his solo albums, he's a very strong singer, and I think he carried the band through this era, and obviously was the most consistent singer they ever had. So, but my number one is the Rising era. Rising is my absolute favorite Rainbow album. That's with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, Richie Blackmore again on guitars, Jimmy Bain on bass. Keyboards was Tony Carey and Cozy Powell on drums. This to me is one of those front to back albums. I can listen to just the entire thing and just absolutely and lose myself in it. In fact, to the point that when I first started driving and I had a CD player and that was in the car, not the one that plugged into the cassette deck, which I had on my very first car that lasted a few years. But I was driving to my first real job, and I could not eject this CD, and it stayed in my CD player for a year. I could not get it to eject, and then one day all of a sudden it did, and I pulled it out, and that's probably why I really haven't listened to Rising much in the last 10 years or so, because I heard it 4 billion times. But I still love the album. I still think it's absolutely amazing, and this era of the band is what got me into Rainbow. So definitely my number one.
Well, I like the list. It's not right though. That's all. But I mean, you can't go wrong picking any of these lineups because all these albums are really, really classic albums in general. They all have something really, really good about them. So it's one of those. It's subjective. That's what we're here for. All right. Well, that's our big four Rainbow lineups, and that brings an end to Debating Metal for tonight. Remember, you can listen to us on any of your favorite podcast platforms, so click like and subscribe and join the debate.
And don't forget to interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or you can send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. If you listen to us on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment and ring that bell to be notified when we post a new episode. And remember to tune in to our next episode as we spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.